Mr. Leon Perera.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Online Safety Miscellaneous Amendments Bill marks a step in the right direction to create some regime for enforcement of basic standards of protection and decency against acts of online harm. I support the thrust of the bill and stand in agreement with the arguments made by my parliamentary colleague, Aljunied MP, Mr. Gerald Giam. In particular, I strongly support Mr. Giam's call on the government to provide clear and unequivocal assurances that this law will not be used to curtail the exercise of legitimate free speech that touches on the public acts of public figures and that is not of a vicious and personal nature. I hope the government can provide such assurances during the parliamentary debate to be recorded in the Hansard. Members will recall how the POHA Act was used by MINDEF to take action against an individual, the legitimacy of which was disputed in a subsequent ruling of the Court of Appeals. Madam, my speech will focus on the topic of online bullying, particularly as pertains to children, and of the harms of loot boxes and other gambling-like elements in electronic games. Before I address these two topics, let me make some general suggestions and clarifications on the approach taken in this bill, where more clarity is perhaps needed. Madam, under the proposed bill, there are two key parts to the regulatory approach. Firstly, requiring OCSs with significant reach or impact to comply with codes of practice, and secondly, dealing with egregious content on an OCS that is accessible by Singapore users, by enabling the IMDA to issue directions to deal with such content. In addition to such measures, and perhaps embedded in the codes of practice, I wonder if there could be a system where users of OCSs can first report content on the platform that is egregious and or seriously harassing to the OCS itself. If the OCS fails to take action within a stipulated time frame, say 7 days, then there could be a mechanism whereby the complainant can raise this issue to the IMDA and ask the IMDA to issue the appropriate directions in relation to such content. This draws on the Australian cyberbullying scheme. One of its features is that a person may make a complaint to eSafety about cyberbullying material that targets an Australian child, and this acts as a safety net because they must have first reported the material to the relevant online service provider before taking this step. In addition, if the OCS fails to investigate or take action, the content reported by a user within the stipulated time frame, take action about that content, there could be penalties for the OCS. While there are already reporting platforms or tools on most, if not all, of the OCSs, such a requirement embedded in a code of practice would create some legal pressure on the OCS to further investigate and act on user notifications or reports of egregious content in a timely manner. Next, Section 45D defines egregious content. While this section does contain some specific definitions of egregious content, there could be other types of egregious content where more specificity would be welcome, as my colleague Mr. Giam and other members alluded to. In particular, I think that the definition of egregious content given here in the bill does not adequately deal with the following two categories. Firstly, revenge porn or unwanted sharing of intimate photos, or intimate images, I should say, and secondly, cyberbullying. But at paragraph 4 of the first reading speech, the June 2022 survey by MCI found that, quote, sexual content, cyberbullying, and violent content were the top 3 types of content that respondents felt that the young needed to be protected from most, unquote. And I was referring there actually not to a speech, but to the statement from MCI. It would seem that the proposed bill might not address the first two concerns in a sufficiently specific manner. In Canada, there's an offense of sharing intimate images without consent. I hope the subsidiary legislation can be more specific about these two types of egregious content. Next, Madam, I note that at paragraph 8 of the Ministry's statement, it is stated that, quote, the COPs may require ROCS providers to put in place measures on their service to mitigate the risks of danger to Singapore users from exposure to harmful content and provide accountability to their users on such measures, unquote. I would like to ask the government how this accountability will come about. Will the government commit to public consultations when new codes of practice are issued? This is hinted at in Section 45L2, but it is not a requirement. I hope that, given the evolving nature of online harms as well as the need to balance privacy and free speech concerns, that a proper consultation process will be the norm in future before new COPs are issued. Next, Madam, Part 9D of the same statement refers to how ROCS providers should collaborate or cooperate with the conduct of research studies by experts approved by IMDA. Such research would allow IMDA to understand the nature and level of the systemic risks in the ROCS and the evolution and severity of such risks. Madam, I support this provision. It's a very positive move for MCI to formally refer to the use of research in this manner, since this area of online harms is a rapidly evolving space, and since more research needs to be done on the effects of certain online activities, particularly on children. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will now move to talking about online bullying of children. Madam, this is a serious issue in Singapore. A 2019 PISA study found that 26% of Singaporean students reported being bullied at least a few times a month, compared to an OECD average of 23%. This is not a small number by any means. Madam, this subject is somewhat personal to me, as there were short periods of time in both my children's primary school life when they were bullied by friends. It is traumatic for the child and can leave lasting psychological scars. But it is also hard on the parents, arousing feelings of concern, frustration, and yet helplessness. Why do I say helplessness? Because sometimes the parent feels that they cannot address the problem with a sledgehammer by coming down hard on the bullies, who are themselves children and may not fully understand what they're doing. The effects of cyberbullying can be deadly. In America, a girl called Megan Meyer committed suicide 3 weeks before her 14th birthday, and her suicide was attributed to cyberbullying on the social networking site MySpace. I think the minister referred to this example as well. Her classmate's mother had created a fake MySpace account pretending to be a teenage boy, Josh, and Josh messaged Megan on AOL Instant Messenger saying something very hurtful. Megan killed herself shortly after. Sir, page 9 of the bill excludes certain services from the scope of the bill, including SMSs and in part quote, an electronic service where the only user-generated content enabled by that service is communication between two or more end users that is of a private or domestic nature, unquote. This would imply that the law excludes bullying that takes place among a group of children where one or more children bullies one child on a chat group, on, say, the victim's Instagram page. So children, madam, children are a group where cyberbullying can have a very serious effect, given their lack of maturity and lack of life experience in accessing resources that could help them. A large-scale National Institutes of Health study in the US found that, and I quote, the child participants who experienced cyberbullying were more than 4 times as likely to report thoughts of suicide and attempts as those who did not. And I think this subject of youth mental health in the context of social media has been the subject of much public discussion, much research, and rightly so, as many experts are tending towards the view that there is a connection between the very extensive social media research that we are seeing, social media usage that we are seeing among young people, and the kinds of mental health issues that are coming to the fore. Madam, how to deal with this is a very difficult question, and I confess that I do not have a legislative magic bullet to suggest here. I am not advocating for law enforcement agencies to police private conversations in a way that compromises privacy, could itself be subject to executive overreach, and could corrode our children's capacity to spontaneously interact with one another as well as learn social lessons thereby. I would suggest that for now, the problem can be addressed through education, and would like to call on MOE and MHA to explore this. There are helplines for young victims of bullying, including cyberbullying, such as Tinkle Friend by the Singapore Children's Society, which does good work and deserves support from all of us. I'm also aware that cyberbullying is addressed in the current curriculum relating to cyber wellness in schools. However, how effective has this been? I would urge the government to conduct further research into this area and study innovative programs that have worked around the world. In particular, we need targeted education in primary and secondary schools that help students to recognize that as bystanders, they have an important responsibility to step in and stop bullying, or at least to not cooperate and to flag out potential issues to teachers or others in authority positions. Encouragingly, the PISA study I cited earlier found that 94% of Singaporean students agree that it is a good thing to help students who cannot defend themselves. But does this translate to bystanders pushing back when bullying actually happens online? This needs to be studied. The role of bystanders here is crucial. For this kind of education to work better, I'm wondering if we can enlist students who have stood up to bullying, either as victims or bystanders, to be anti-bullying ambassadors who give talks in schools as to what they experienced, what they did, how they coped, and also when and how to bring the authorities in, as opposed to necessarily escalating every single situation to people in authority.
Order.
Perhaps
Pursuant to Standing Order Number 2, 5D, I propose to extend the time of this day's sitting beyond the moment of interruption for a period of up to 30 minutes.
And perhaps video clips and other communications materials can be rolled out to a mass audience featuring such anti-bullying ambassadors. Next, Madam, let me move on to the subject of loot boxes and other gambling-like elements in electronic games. Madam, I've asked several parliamentary questions about this subject. The most recent was in 2019, which elicited the reply that the Remote Gambling Act would apply to loot boxes only if the loot thus obtained could potentially be converted into real-world money. To quote from that 2019 reply, and I quote, "Given the randomness of the prizes in loot boxes, they are a game of chance. However, whether the loot boxes are considered a form of gambling under the RGA depends on whether there are in-game facilities that allow players to convert game credits or any in-game items, for example, weapons and skills, to real-world money or merchandises," unquote. I also spoke about this subject in the 2020 MHA Committee of Supply debate, pointing out that loot boxes, a consumable virtual item used to redeem a randomized selection of further virtual items, are increasingly seen in some quarters as a form of gambling. I highlighted that from a study by academics at the University of York, there is some evidence linking loot boxes to problem gambling. Belgium has banned loot boxes purchased using real money. The UK National Health Service has also called for the industry to ban loot boxes. Its mental health director, Claire Murdoch, warned that these were in danger of, quote, "setting kids up for addiction," unquote. Since my 2020 speech in this House, fresh research has strengthened the evidence of a causative link between loot boxes and problem gambling. The report carried out by a report produced by researchers at the universities of Plymouth and Wolverhampton in the UK, as reported by the BBC in April last year, found that loot boxes, quote, "are structurally and psychologically akin to gambling," unquote. According to the study in the UK, and I quote again, of the 93% of children who play video games, up to 40% open loot boxes. 12 out of 13 studies on the topic have established unambiguous connections to problem gambling behavior. The big spenders, the crucial 5% for the industry, can spend more than 70 or 100 British pounds a month on the boxes, the report said. A report from the Norwegian Consumer Council from May 2022 suggests that some of these in-game gambling-like elements, quote, "contribute to a sense of anticipation and reward and are presumably designed to trigger dopamine releases that keep the player opening packs," unquote. Madam, my concern is that aside from young children spending money in something that is potentially of little benefit, there is the risk that our young children playing these games, or perhaps a significant minority of them, craving that dopamine hit, could experience changes in their brain chemistry that would render them more susceptible to problem gambling as adults. The studies I cited show that there is some evidence to support this. Madam, problem gambling is a serious social problem. While it affects a small percentage of the population directly, the financial losses and social harm they generate can easily affect their family members and loved ones. I am glad to note that the Gambling Regulatory Authority announced in August this year that it is looking at loot boxes. I hope that stronger action will be taken against such elements in games beyond just a dollar cap. To be sure, electronic games can nurture positive traits, such as strategic thinking, information processing, and mental agility. But the elements in some games which suggest that players can pay to play, as it were, but with randomized results, could well result in mental habituation and attraction towards gambling later in life. If the government will not ban such elements outright, as I hope it will, I hope at the very least that it would mandate warning labels on games that would draw parents' attention to the potential links to problem gambling. That would serve as a nudge to game developers to remove such elements from their games. I hope that such measures can be incorporated into the subsidiary legislation for this bill or to another act. Thank you.